Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi.
On behalf of the Tebow Library and the American Democracy Project, we welcome you to our Times Talk today. Today we are very excited to have Dr. Peter Tramel to talk about the ongoing Ukraine war. And I think we all remember that last year the Trump administration proposed the 28 points to end the war. And since then we have a lot of discussions and setbacks and dreams and hopes and nightmares. So today Dr. Tramel will lead us, will guide us through the lens of humanity, history, and philosophy to look at the current proposals and the ongoing negotiation. Hopefully, we can end the war. Thank you. Dr. Tramel.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the American Democracy Project for having me. When I volunteered to do this back in November, I had read the 28-point plan and that put forward by the Trump administration, had objections, thought it might be worth talking about. Since then, a lot has happened. I actually don't know what proposals are being considered right now in Abu Dhabi, if that's still happening, but it's been happening recently. And some reports out of there sounded promising for about 5 minutes, and now it sounds like nothing very good is happening. But meanwhile, I am not a Ukraine expert. I do pay attention to the news and history. I'm not a Ukraine expert. The only relevant expertise I have is in just war theory, which is philosophy, but also it's interdisciplinary. Philosophy and law, political science, all those disciplines involved.
Justice in only or justice in justice?
Just war theory, it could be, I'll say more about it, but it's kind of, but just war theory is everything that's not pacifism or anything goes, all is fair in war. So one extreme you have pacifists who say no to all war. On the other extreme,
Like justice is what
yeah, it could be justification for war, it can be justice in war, it can be justice in ending wars, it can be all those things. Anyhow, a couple people have talked to me the last week. They saw the flyer and said, I'm sorry I can't come hear how you're going to end the war in Ukraine, and I hope nobody came with the expectation that I was going to do that. I'm just going to talk about some of the principles that I think ought to apply and some of the things that are happening. So a little bit of application of principles to this. Some of you may have seen this meme. It's been around for a few years, but some anniversaries. I'm going to just talk about a few things that are going on, and then I'll get into the other stuff. But this meme was, I saw it on social media several times, it's posted by different people, but this is the Odessa City Opera in 1942, when the Nazis were coming, and on the right is 2022, when the Russians were coming. And in both cases, it's all sandbagged, and the tank obstacles and things are there. On January 12th, the current war in Ukraine passed the 1941 to 1945 German USSR war in duration. So it's been going on now longer than that did. February 22nd will mark the 4-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Casualty numbers, trying to put any kind of numbers on the suffering is difficult. Obviously, both sides keep their casualty numbers secret. Those are military secrets. Both sides tend to exaggerate how many of the other they kill, and so on. But NATO estimates put us with numbers like these: casualties between 1.5 and 2 million, with at least 500,000 dead. More than 10 million Ukrainian people displaced, with more than 6 million having fled abroad, and between 3.7 and 6.9 internally displaced persons in Ukraine. Russia losing between 20 and 35,000 soldiers killed per month, according to NATO. So pretty grim stuff. And some of you, if you follow the news, have probably seen about the suffering this winter without power in sub-zero temperatures and stuff of most of the population of Ukraine. Terrible. Although the whole country has been affected, most of the fighting is, of course, in the east. In 2014, Russia occupied Crimea, and they started to occupy through a pro-Russian Ukrainian movement. They started to occupy parts of Donetsk, or Luhansk and Donetsk, the Donbass. These two together are called the Donbass. You probably hear the Donbass a lot in the news. They've occupied territory here. In fact, current situation, BBC. This is the red is territory controlled by Russia at the present moment, or at least as of a week ago. Russia has launched an offensive just in the past week, driving towards Kharkiv and in the south towards the city of Zaporizhia, if I probably say these things wrong, somewhere in here. Anyhow, I'll say more about that in a minute. I saw some potential good things in the 28-point plan. It might be a good idea for the Ukrainian-controlled portions of Donetsk to become a militarized zone. I'm not sure about that, but I didn't have strong objections to the idea. The portion of Donetsk that Ukraine still controls is vitally important to its future defense. It has very in-depth defenses built in that region. If they abandon it, they're open to easy invasion. Ukraine's sovereignty confirmed. This was point number one, although the treaty went on to contradict this in about 15 different ways afterwards. So sovereignty means national self-determination, a right of national self-determination. And so things that take that away, of course, contradict sovereignty. Potential for international security guarantees regarding EU membership for Ukraine, regarding fair use of the Dnipro River, however you really say that, and the Black Sea, regarding prisoners, detainees, and hostages, regarding the cessation of hostilities. These were things in the 28-point plan that I found unobjectionable. There might be reasons to object to some of them that I don't know, but I found unobjectionable. Lots of things would be objectionable from the point of view of just war theory. I didn't pass out a copy of the 28 points or anything like that, so I know the numbers won't mean a lot. I'll talk about some of them, but there's a whole bunch of points that mention security guarantees, but none are actually provided in the treaty. Points 10, 12, and 27 are essentially about how the U.S. could get Ukraine's assets in mineral rights and rebuilding contracts and that kind of thing. Points 6, 7, and 25 are all in contradiction to point 1. It would limit the size of Ukraine's military, basically, making it easier for Russia to take the rest of it, and things like that. Points 13, these other points, preemptive international concessions to Russia for no apparent reason. Why should the international community reward Russian aggression in ways that have nothing to do with the security of Ukraine or endurance of peace? It might be that we should offer things to Russia like this if it would help to get them to cease hostilities, to cease aggression. But we shouldn't preemptively do that. I'll come back to that too. And maybe we're not preemptively doing that. I have no idea what actually happened in the discussions. We're not privileged to that information. Ukraine rejected this plan, is unwilling to accept any permanent concessions of territory to Russia. That's still Ukraine's position. No permanent concessions of territory to Russia. Or limitations on its sovereignty, telling it which organizations Ukraine can and cannot join in the future. How big Ukraine's military can be, these kinds of things, limits on their sovereignty. Having to write things into their constitution, this kind of thing. Ukraine was unwilling to concede the 30% of Donetsk that it still controls because that would leave them defenseless against future Russian aggression, especially given other provisions of the plan. They reasonably fear the fate of Czechoslovakia after Munich in 1938, which I'll talk about in a minute. Ukraine was unwilling to submit to future U.S.-Russian control of its mineral rights and other natural resources. I'll stop for a second. Can you hear me back there, Clark? Good, okay, because I didn't put on a mic or anything. You can? Okay, good, thank you. Infamously, the famous appeasement, 1938. There's some differences but similarities to what's happening in Ukraine with what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1938. Hitler found there were ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland, the dark brown. This is high ground, low mountains or high hills, whatever you want to call it. This was highlands, the Sudetenland. There were a lot of ethnic Germans there. Germany encouraged them to rebel against Czech rule and gave them military equipment and pushed propaganda that they were being abused by the Czech government and so on. This might sound familiar to anyone who's followed the Ukraine conflict.
Is that sort of what happened in Donbass?
Yeah, it's very much like what happened in Donbass. But historians have all been noticing that, hey, this Russian strategy looks just like something we saw before in 1938. Yeah. Anyhow, at the Munich Agreement, Chamberlain and Daladier, the British Prime Minister, and the French, whatever he was, President, I don't know, whatever they called it, their leader, they made a deal with Hitler and Mussolini that Germany could have the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise to leave the rest of Czechoslovakia alone. In exchange, Scouts honor, right? And this is Chamberlain. He went home and had a big press moment where he announced he had achieved peace in our time. Very famously, peace in our time. Within 2 months, Germany had overrun the rest of Czechoslovakia, so I think in this case, similarly, really a promise from Russia in a treaty would be equally valuable as that paper that Chamberlain is holding there. If as much, yeah. So there would have to be a real security agreement for a peace to be plausibly something Ukraine should consider.
I can assume that none of the points included any reference to NATO, them joining NATO or having NATO as part of the security plan, right?
The only mention in NATO was that NATO would not put troops in Ukraine, and that Ukraine would write into its constitution that it will never join NATO.
Okay.
That was the only mentions of NATO in the 28-point plan. Yeah. Russia claims it won't stop till it has all of Donbass, and whatever they consider to be a defensible land bridge to Crimea. So Donbass, Crimea, and the two southeastern provinces, Zaporizhia and Kherson. As I was preparing for this, there were talks going on in Abu Dhabi. The news was different every day. There was lots of conflicting reports. The talks were being conducted by Stephen Witkoff for the United States. And Russia, and Zelensky was there. The president of Ukraine was there. I don't know if that's big enough to see, but it's not super important. On January 24th, Witkoff announced that the negotiations had narrowed things down to 1 point of disagreement. Zelensky then said no, it hadn't. He said it's still too early to draw conclusions on February 5th. Zelensky said that there are still multiple points in dispute and that the foremost is an international security agreement for Ukraine. That's not just a promise to be good from Russia. On the 7th, President Trump announced a June deadline for a peace deal. He's done this several times before with no follow-through or anything, so I don't know if that's meaningful. But he claimed he would put more pressure on both sides if they didn't agree to something by June. A couple days ago, the EU announced that it was completely frustrated with the U.S. efforts to end the war and that it was going to come up with its own plan. They undertook this out of concern that the U.S.-led negotiations concede too much to Russia without realistic security guarantees for Ukraine or Europe. Their main goal is to ensure that any peace deal is durable, securing a just and lasting peace. However, there was something in this that is kind of an obstacle to that, and that is they think that Ukraine should not permanently concede any territory. And if Ukraine doesn't permanently concede any territory, then it's just a kind of ceasefire waiting for both sides to decide they're ready to fight again. So that would be a little bit in conflict with the durable and lasting peace. So what is just war theory, Gary asked.
There's the judge.
Yeah, if you read in just war theory, you have to learn just a little bit of Latin. You have to know these words. Jus ad bellum is justification for war, justification for going to war. Jus in bello is just conduct in war. And jus post bellum is what we're mainly talking about here, justice in ending a war. I won't use these Latin phrases a lot, but if you read in this literature, they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Jus post bellum, justice in ending wars, easily the most neglected part of just war theory. Most of the legal scholars, philosophers, political scientists who write in this field tend to ignore this one, jus post bellum. And most of the existing scholarly work on the topic concerns only cases in which the good guys win. Right? So what should we do? What should the good guys do after they win? And thinking about the end of World War II and things like the Nuremberg trials, should the punishment of war criminals, they're war criminals, of course, and so on. When the side that has more justice on its side, for example, the Allied side in World War II, wins the war. Some of these guys, by the way, are on trial not for their crimes against humanity, like the Holocaust. Some of them are, by the way. Some of them are on trial for the Holocaust and crimes against humanity. But some of them are on trial for crimes against peace, making aggressive war. And von Ribbentrop was hung for specifically that, the German foreign minister who helped engineer the invasion of Poland and so forth. In considering justice in ending wars, we must consider justice in how they started and how they were conducted. According to the principles of jus ad bellum, Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine is the victim. And that becomes an important distinction. Russia would obviously not accept that characterization, but it would be hard to argue for any other characterization in a serious and real way. That is, Russia invaded Ukraine without moral or legal just cause, forcing Ukrainians to surrender their rights or fight. This is often called the crime of aggression, crime against peace in international law. The crime against peace, or the crime of aggression, consists in forcing peoples to lose their rights or fight, giving them that option, forcing that option on them. Aggression, so, and I say that, in this case the aggression also violated various international agreements. You could just name the UN Charter, include things like that, including agreements Russia has signed in recent years, the agreement for Ukrainian sovereignty in 1992 in exchange for Ukraine giving all its nuclear weapons back to the Soviet nuclear arsenal that was in Ukraine. They gave it back to Russia in exchange for a Russian promise of their sovereignty. Which,
Interesting.
a promise that Putin obviously repudiated. It's a problem with new leaders. They can say, I'm not bound by whatever my predecessor, Yeltsin or Gorbachev, I'm not bound by anything Yeltsin or Gorbachev did, things like that. It follows that Ukraine has a just cause in fighting to defend its territory, including fighting to regain all Ukrainian territory that Russia now controls, according to just war theory. It also follows that Russia has no just title to any Ukrainian territory it now occupies, and that its responsible leaders are subject to punishment for war crimes. Don't hold your breath, there's nobody who can make this happen. Right.
Unless Russia's defeated.
Unless Russia would be defeated not only in Ukraine, but it would have to be defeated to such an extent that you could put Russian leaders in the dock the way you saw Nazi leaders in the dock in Nuremberg in 1946. That picture was German leaders in the dock in Nuremberg in 1946. There was recently some kind of movie about Nuremberg or something. I haven't seen it. I'm interested. I was a young soldier stationed in Nuremberg for 2.5 years.
It's hard to see a movie when you have a theater anymore.
Yeah. I have to watch it streaming, I think.
Yeah.
However, just cause isn't the only important thing in justification for war. It also requires a reasonable chance of success, and it requires proportionality, something called proportionality, a kind of utility condition. And so you could have a just cause but still not be justified in fighting. I have a picture here from the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. It was admired by the West. The brave and plucky Hungarians rise up against their Soviet overlords. They had no chance of success. Russia crushed them, obviously. It's the Soviet Union, I should say. The Soviet Union crushed them. There were people in the West who called for us to intervene. But it was judged to be non-proportional to intervene because it would have meant war with a war between nuclear powers. And as much as we love the Hungarians, a war between nuclear powers, playing around with the possible extinction of our species, seemed like too high of a cost. And that's going to also apply to thinking about third parties in Ukraine. According to just war theory and some international law, if a country is invaded unjustly, all other countries have a right to go to its defense and fight for it. However, if this means war between nuclear powers, it seems like the cost is too high, it's not proportional. Which would be the main argument for Germany and France. Germany's not a nuclear power, but they're part of NATO, which is. It would be the main argument for NATO not just going in there and fighting with Ukraine against Russia. Yeah, no, go for it, please.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's clear, maybe it's not. Why is that requirement of a reasonable chance of success there? What's that doing?
Well, the idea is if you don't have a reasonable chance of success, then people die for no reason. You know, the Hungarians who rose up against the Soviet Union obviously suffered a lot. The Soviet Union made damn sure they suffered a lot and accomplishing nothing, right? So the idea, the reasonable chance of success. Many just war theorists actually argue that this condition too is waived if you're in a backs to the wall situation, like it's fight or be enslaved. Then they want to waive this requirement and say, okay, this requirement no longer applies. Like if you were a Polish Jew in World War II, it wouldn't apply to you because if you don't fight, you're off to the gas chamber, right? So if you're in the Warsaw Ghetto, you have no reasonable chance of success, but you're not wrong to fight. How could we say you were wrong to fight? Clark?
Yeah, it would seem that you could always make it just a balance of the options you have available to you.
Yeah.
And a cost-benefit analysis of the two.
Yeah, it's ultimately just a
If your option was
utilitarian.
live in a kind of repressive regime, it doesn't give you free speech, but people aren't being just routinely killed, tortured, enslaved, things like that.
Yeah.
And you're going to, risk complete annihilation with almost no chance of success, or not so good. That's where they might say, well, that's what the Hungarian Revolution did. It went from something that wasn't good, but chose something which was horrific
Yeah,
in the very likely scenarios. Whereas when you say, okay, like Ukraine could say, look, this is existential. If we don't fight here, where are they going to stop? They
Yeah.
control all of our country.
They
take
do
all the
say
lands.
that.
And what they've done to the cities they've attacked, they're wastelands. I mean, the western part of Ukraine is there's nothing there. The cities are rubble.
yeah, and what they discovered, I forget the name of the city north of Kyiv, where the Russians took it, and then it was liberated by Ukraine a few weeks later, and what they found there gave them plenty of evidence of what would happen to them if they lost this war. They found Ukrainians tortured and killed and so on. So they know what their option. They know what defeat means. Interestingly, and polls, and I don't know about this polling, no expert on polls, but polls say that 52% to 54% of Ukrainians prefer fighting to giving Russia Donbass. Like, if their options are surrender Donbass and Ukraine will just become the remainder. Still more than half, after all they've suffered, that's this year, after all they've suffered, still more than half would rather continue the war than give up Donbass, which is, that's determination.
Well, that sort of mindset fits within classical international relations theory,
Yeah,
in that as a rational actor for a state to survive, you aren't going to want to insist on sovereignty and everything that entails.
yeah.
Whereas, and when I'm trying to explain a lot of classical theories in relation to the behavior of Ukraine and Russia, I can't really characterize any of the behavior from Russia as rational, given the length of the war, the cost endured in terms of loss of life, being an outcast economically and diplomatically.
It seems to you like the cost-benefit analysis, even if you're Russian and you look at it totally selfishly, benefit to Russia and cost to Russia is not worth it. You're saying it doesn't seem worth it.
Given how much potential land they would stand to gain under the peace plan or any sort of agreement, when Ukraine insists that there isn't going to be any land concessions. Because the whole premise was, well, this will be a potential buffer against NATO, Ukraine, taking this land. But, I mean...
In one way that I agree with you also is that, ironically, doing this caused Finland and Sweden to join NATO. So if the point of this was to keep NATO off their borders, it backfired amazingly, right? It definitely didn't work. Even if they managed to keep NATO out of Ukraine forever, they now have it in Finland, right, and Sweden.
It seems they miscalculated their chance of success.
They probably, this is a common thing, aggressors typically think they're going to have quick success. And, yeah, Amber.
I have a question about just war theory.
Sure.
So you used the case of the Hungarian Revolution to show like cost benefit, but you're thinking in terms of human life. In reality, doesn't 1956 spark massive dissident movements throughout the Soviet bloc that ultimately leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union? So is it only human cost analysis, or is it also ideological?
It could have been worth it in the long run, and people are not clear or in agreement about whether it is just a matter of It's not supposed to be just short-term thinking, like in the short term. So if the long-term benefits of that really did matter, then it was justified, even though there was no reasonable chance of success. The proportionality here, I guess, would be more important than the chance of success. And it can be the case that sacrifices can matter. Fighting and losing could still mean something down the road like that. That's a good point. Could be worth doing. I don't know if in this case it did or not. You actually know more about that than I do.
I mean, scholars would argue, a lot of scholars have, not me, obviously Hungary is not my realm of expertise, but they do argue that this sparks dissidence movements throughout.
Yeah. I suppose in any kind of dissident movement, there has to be a lot of sacrifice and failure, and that it could take decades for anything good to happen. Eventually, the Soviet Union did collapse. It was, I think, mostly for economic reasons, but I'm not expert in that. I did get to see it. I was a young soldier stationed in Germany when the wall came down and so on. So it was super exciting. And we thought the world was going to be, we were much more optimistic than the succeeding years justified when that happened.
I don't want to take us too far afield into ethical theory. This leads to a criticism that's levied sometimes about the foundations actually of utilitarianism and the epistemic issues involved. Because, well, how far do you go in measuring cost benefits?
Yeah.
And we generally concede that you have less epistemic. You know less about the far distant future. You can predict it with less accuracy than you can in the near term. So we could have this odd situation, and it's like that sort of story people tell. Well, it's like, okay, hey, that worked out great. We'll see. And then
We'll see.
Things can turn back and forth. And we might say, well, maybe in 100 years we'll say that Russia was right to have invaded Ukraine.
That definitely goes to
to
Dr. Nichols' point. Yeah.
Because we're just guessing. So but you could be in that odd circumstance saying, well, a utilitarian or even just war theory analysis would have said they were mistaken. They should not have engaged in this revolution. What they knew at that time, the available evidence to them was such that that is unreasonable to have done that. Even though later, 30 years or more later, you could say, well, it panned out then, but they didn't know that.
Yeah, all of this is difficult to calculate. There's expected utility and real utility. There's what we expect to happen and what really happens. And then there's I don't want to go into ethical theory exactly, but there's these kind of consequential considerations, and then there's sort of human rights considerations and so forth that can conflict with those. So something could be potentially the best outcome in terms of suffering, but also violate human rights, and then we have a kind of a problem. There's quite a bit of work in just war theory about those kind of conflicts. Fighting without a reasonable chance of success can only, in some cases at least, only adds to the amount of suffering and death. In 1968, the United States rejected peace terms with Vietnam in negotiations in Paris. That's Kissinger in Paris, negotiating with the North Vietnamese. In 1972, the U.S. accepted basically the same terms as were offered in 1968. A lot of people died in between 1968 and 1972 in Vietnam. A little bit here about proportionality. We've been talking about this. It applies to all phases of just war theory. Major proportionality complications. I want to see how I'm doing. There's a clock there. Okay, I'm fine. Major proportionality complications for third parties in seeking to end unjust wars as justly as possible. So if we're from our point of view, third parties seeking to end unjust wars as justly as possible, right? So they're not going to end justly. If they're not going to end justly with the victory of the good guys, then we have to consider what should we settle for. And one of the things to consider is, will the terms of the treaty cause a worse war in the future? And I have some famous examples. The end of the Franco-Prussian War, that's Napoleon III surrendering to the Prussians. In the treaty that ends that, France has to give up Alsace and Lorraine. Kind of like their Donbass, Alsace and Lorraine. All France thinks about for the next 40 years is getting Alsace and Lorraine back. That's all they prepare for and train for. That's all they talk about. That becomes the, I can't say French words right, but raison d'être, the raison d'être, reason of existence. For France after the Franco-Prussian War, revenge and restoration of our territory. In World War I, they finally do get it back. And then there's the Treaty of Versailles. There's the Versailles guys, David Lloyd George for England and Clemenceau for France and so on, imposing harsh terms on a defeated Germany, including that it has to give Alsace and Lorraine back. And of course, less than 30 years later, there's Germans marching into Alsace-Lorraine, right? So obviously, well, when we think about concluding a war, we have to think, to what extent does this treaty make it likely that there will be a worse war in the future? Each of these wars was worse than the one before, right? So the Franco-Prussian War was bad. World War I was worse. World War II was worse still. Successful aggression, so when a treaty rewards an aggressor, tends to encourage and provide political cover for future aggression. British aggression in South Africa against the Orange Free State in the Transvaal in 1899, 1900, 1901, there's a bit in there. Encouraged Germany to get busy with wars of aggression in Africa too. That's Germans in Namibia, copying Britain's example of wars of aggression in Africa. The British got away with it. It's our turn. We want some Africa too, please. Treaty negotiations provoke escalations of violence. I saw somebody on the news yesterday saying the fact that the Russians are launching offensives means they're not serious about peace. That might be true. They might not be serious. But that doesn't necessarily mean that. Often people are launch offenses during negotiations to try to win a better place at the bargaining table. Like the leverage. The United States tried that by bombing Hanoi to rubble during the negotiations in 1972 with Operation Linebacker 2, the B-52s leveling Hanoi, killing untold numbers of people. Didn't do any good, but it's typical behavior. It's typical behavior of parties negotiating, trying to win advantages on the battlefield that they can bring to the negotiating table. Truman had the ultimate one at Potsdam, negotiating with Russia about the future fate of Europe after World War II, and he was able to tell them, we have this new bomb, we just dropped it on Hiroshima. And we didn't have enough soldiers in Europe to scare the Soviet Union at that point, but anyway, so Hiroshima may have partly been about this too. Nagasaki. Maximum restoration of human rights of persons on all sides of conflict. That's normally a thing that's a condition. I have a picture of the Treaty of Westphalia here, very famous. Some people call it the birth of modern sovereignty, things like that. But the reason I have it here is because there was a kind of example of that. The war had started as a religious war. It became a much more complicated thing. But the 30 Years' War, which this ended, very bloody war. 2/3 of the population of Germany died during the 30 Years' War, to give you some idea. But it started as a religious war, and at the conclusion of the war, one of the things in the Treaty of Westphalia was that Protestants in Catholic nations and Catholics in Protestant nations would henceforth not be persecuted. So that's the kind of thing we're thinking about here. A peace treaty in Ukraine should include something for Ukrainians who end up living under Russian rule and Russians who end up living under Ukrainian rule, however it gets settled, should enjoy protections. The 50 million pound elephant in the world, this of course has to, Russia is a nuclear power, this has to factor in any discussion. The one thing the world really, as bad as the war is in Ukraine, the one thing that seems much worse would be the kind of direct confrontation between nuclear powers. We've never had that. Nuclear powers have fought each other, but always through proxy. And it's happened, in a way, the Ukraine war is that, a kind of proxy war between Russia and the West.
Wasn't the Vietnam War considered that too?
It was. The Vietnam War, the Korean War, lots of wars. So that you didn't have direct confrontation of nuclear powers. Instead, they fought each other through proxies. But if you had a direct confrontation between nuclear powers, suppose that it was conventional at first, no nuclear weapons were used. Sooner or later, one of them is going to start to lose. And then what is it going to do?
Resort.
Right. I have just a couple of more things and then just open it up to more discussion. But, so where does this leave us? From the point of just war theory, since Ukraine is the victim nation, third parties should not threaten it with penalties for not ceding territory or sovereignty. Unfortunately, some of that's happened. That some parties have threatened Ukraine, some third parties have threatened Ukraine with penalties if they don't play ball. Such threats do not merely enable current aggression, they promote it and encourage future aggression. Moreover, Ukraine has a right to fight and correlatively a right to decide when to quit as the victim nation. However, if in their best judgment, third parties believe that Ukraine has no reasonable chance of success in regaining lost territories, and that could be the situation, or could become the situation, it looks like the situation, or of doing so in a way that is consistent with proportionality. Oh, sorry. That was to remind me to shut up soon. No, I did want to sort of leave some time for discussion, more time for discussion. Okay, so then third parties should try to persuade Ukraine to accept terms, but they shouldn't try to force it. They shouldn't try to level sanctions on Ukraine for not playing ball, say because they want some kind of political theater moment or something like that. Important note, from an outside point of view, as much as this war breaks our hearts and we want it to stop, its continuation is not the worst possible outcome. Just ask Neville Chamberlain's ghost. Right? There are worse things than the continuation of the war. The war is a horrible thing, but there are worse things. Realistic, durable security guarantees. I take it this is where Ukraine is hung up the most. They obviously don't want to permanently surrender territory or have their sovereignty snipped or degraded. However, what they especially want is to be sure that Russia can't attack them again. For obvious reasons. What could achieve that? Well, if Ukraine surrenders territory but does not permanently cede it to Russia in the treaty, then the seeds of a future worse war are well planted. Ukraine would be within its rights to accept such a plan, but it does not seem likely to be durable. Although it could last a long time, the Korean War has lasted basically with a ceasefire since 1952. Right? It's a tense situation, and both sides stay armed to the teeth and wind up on both sides of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, right? And have been since 1952. And that is a possible kind of a thing. That war never concluded with a peace treaty, it just stopped with a ceasefire that has held. Both sides have judged the violating the ceasefire to be not in their interest ever since 1952, although there's been plenty of threats. If Ukraine agrees to something like the terms of the Trump administration's 28-point plan, then its defenses would be greatly weakened, and we could anticipate, we already talked about that, we could anticipate that they would lose the rest of their country. The most likely ways to ensure durable peace and security for Ukraine and Europe in a treaty that ends the war would be either a commitment by somebody, the US, NATO, EU, somebody, to actually go to war against Russia if Russia violates the treaty. Or a commitment by at least one of the third parties about to increase Ukrainian defense capabilities after the war to keep pace with any possible increases in Russian offensive capabilities. So in other words, to bolster Ukraine's military power with training, equipment, money, anything they need to keep it in pace with any kind of similar action by Russia, right?
But not nuclear weapons.
But not nuclear weapons,
Why not?
right? Well, that's a consideration. Giving them a nuclear weapon would,
We gave them to Israel.
yeah, we did not. Yeah, that's supposed to be a secret.
Oh, we can keep this a secret, Jim. We can keep this one a secret.
Yeah, we could do that and keep it a secret like that. Anyhow, yeah, that's something, food for thought. I don't think anyone's considering it, but it's food for thought. It is a cheaper way of having defense. One of the reasons North Korea wanted to develop nuclear weapons is because it was a lot less expensive than trying to have the kind of conventional force they would need to win a war on the Korean Peninsula.
Because the conventional forces of NATO greatly outnumber Russia's conventional forces.
Yeah, right now Russia couldn't win a war against NATO,
Oh,
a conventional war.
Mhm.
But Putin says every couple of weeks that he'd be perfectly happy to use nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
Probably bluffing, but who would like to find out? Right, not me. That kind of bluffing is scary. It also makes you, if people are willing to bluff like that and play chicken with nuclear weapons, it makes me wonder how long we're all going to be around. The EU seems to be, they haven't published a plan, but their press release suggested that they're pushing some combination of 2.1 and the B option here. That what they're pushing is that for Russia, for Ukraine to surrender, to agree to a ceasefire but not permanently surrender territory, and then for the EU to guarantee Ukrainian surrender by the B method, or sorry, not surrender, security, to guarantee Ukrainian security through the B method. Some points in the Trump administration's November plan that are eminently reasonable, I kind of talked about some of that. I'll just let you look at that for a second and then I'll go on. I'm going to stop talking really very soon. But these are all things that seem to me like should plausibly be in a peace plan. Regarding some other parts, especially the parts relating to the U.S. making money off the deal at the expense of Ukraine, which was a large part of what was in the 28-point plan. One of the reasons I was kind of angry and wanted to talk about it. I don't know how much of that is still going on. But if Ukraine must accept losses of territory or limitations of sovereignty, third-party nations should not seek to build pecuniary, financial, or publicity advantages for their leaders at Ukraine's expense into the treaty. That is the diplomacy moral equivalent of common looting and extortion, basically. It would simply be looting them because we can, because they're in no position to say no. Okay, that's it. We'll open it up for questions or thoughts or anything. Yeah.
Peter, it looks like just war theory is being effectively challenged, and that's why this is important, because we seem to be setting new precedents here. And, you know, either we're going to go back to just war plan, or we're going to move to something different. And you didn't mention our administration's threats to conquer and annex Greenland. So to that degree, it looks like our country is in many ways kind of going along with abolishing the just war and moving to something where the hegemonist countries can take advantage of their power.
Yeah, I didn't want to talk, I don't want to go out on too many limbs, but certainly it looks like the just war theory considerations matter a lot less to the current administration than they ever have mattered to any previous U.S. administration. Just war theory arguments. No government has just said we are just war theorists, but just war theory arguments have carried weight before, and now seem maybe like they don't, like maybe we're moving into, well, if you heard Stephen Miller, just a mic that makes right sort of ancient model. You are my slave because I have the power to make you so. That's in the words of an Athenian general in the Peloponnesian War, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And that kind of rhetoric is what we're hearing from the administration, right? And so definitely it is moving away from any kind of taking just war theory seriously.
Of course, you well noted a lot of the considerations that you make here. Some of them are very, in one sense, tactical, strategic, practical, military considerations.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't have, we don't have a general agreement even on those issues, because you have, certainly Russia is notorious now for making outrageous claims.
Yeah.
The generals even report to Putin, and people wonder, is Putin just being deceived or no? He just wants this, and of course, people who don't give him positive news, you get falling out of window disease.
Well, yeah, and this kind of making these claims has become kind of a worldwide phenomenon. It's a bigger it's a whole other topic, I think, but
it poisons the negotiation sometimes, where you have
which might be
our
the point.
administration saying, "Oh, you have no card." And it's like, well, Russia's not winning this war by many calculations. They're bleeding themselves dry.
NATO
They cannot sustain this.
the chief of NATO said that Russia can't sustain the level of conflict through 2026. It's out of gas, basically. Not gas, they have that. They do have that.
Refined.
Out of
They have
resources.
crude, but
Yeah.
Ukraine has successfully taken out many of their refineries. Even.
They've used up the North Korean ammo. They can't replace their own ammo and equipment according to the NATO chief, through this year. So they might actually be desperate to make a peace too. They don't want anybody to know that, and they're going to act like they could fight forever either way. So it's going to be hard to know, right? Because whatever they don't have, they're going to certainly bluff, right? And Dr. Nichols.
It's not a fully formed question, sorry.
No, it's okay.
So one of the things that Ukraine is suffering right now is this catastrophic demographic loss, particularly in the realm of young men.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to like future ability to protect oneself, how does something like that factor into discussions about that? Because they won't be able to demographically recover in order to have a military to do so.
It should, if the EU's plan is what I understood them to be saying, they haven't said anything about it yet. They seem to have the idea that they could, through giving Ukraine equipment and things like that, they can make Ukraine strong enough to always resist Russia. But yeah, and that's one of the problems. I mean, Ukraine's an incredibly tough country. Not many countries. They're a country of 39 million, basically, like about California population. Not many countries that size could have resisted what they've resisted. I think super tough. But yeah, the demographic losses. They're fighting a country of 150 million, and
It's a war of attrition.
so if it's a war of losing young men in Russia, they run out first. There's no doubt about that. If that's what it's down to, is who runs out of young men first, then Ukraine's destined to lose.
That's how the ratios of losses matter.
Yeah,
Russia is losing more, faster.
they are, but I don't think enough more that
Yes.
that it would counterbalance the effect.
Well, we lost a lot less in the Vietnam War, but still the pressure was on us to quit.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we did lose a lot less than we inflicted, but
Less meant more to us than it did to them, I guess.
yeah, trying to conquer a country that won't have it it can be that way. North Vietnam put up with losses that even makes Ukraine look small, right? in order to not lose that war to us. This is some kind of satanic math we're talking about, but you know, I mean, dark, evil, terrible stuff. Other questions or thoughts? So we definitely didn't end the Ukraine war. I don't know if it will end soon, but I just wanted to talk about, as a third party, the kinds of things we ought to be thinking about for peace treaties, at least according to just war theory.
Thank you.
Good.
I had a thought. You mentioned against justification for the proportionality of the chance of success in winning a war as if that's a reason for a victim to engage in war, but you said that there are exceptions to that, such as when their backs are against the wall.
Yeah.
Is that an exception for third-party interveners?
Well, I don't think, if you're in that situation, you're not a third party, because if you're in that situation, you're in the war,
Yeah.
right? You're either defending yourself or something. So yeah, but what should a third party say if one party is in that situation? Like those questions are difficult. They came up during Rwanda, like a big discussion in 1994, I think. When was Rwanda? Is it 94? Came up during Rwanda about whether we had obligations to intervene to stop the genocide that was happening there, right? And President Clinton, who was president at that time, later apologized and said he was wrong not to intervene. But at the time, his administration kind of waffled about it and kept punting and getting the press secretary up there talking gibberish and nonsense like they do when they don't have a good answer, things like that. If you're going to be a press secretary, that has to be in your skill set.
Fluent in gibberish.
Fluent in deflective gibberish, No, it's a good question.
And it is true, Peter, that we have withdrawn, as our country, we've withdrawn material support, at least from, or maybe financial too, from Ukraine since the new administration took over, and that has made it a lot more difficult for Ukraine to fight off Russia.
Actually, before the current administration, because now President Trump, then candidate Trump talked Mike Johnson, who was Speaker of the House, into slowing up our aid even before he was elected. So yeah, even before that. That said, I didn't want to talk about sort of how we got here. I wanted to sort of think realistically about how much support could Ukraine expect. And
remember, did he support them in his first administration? It was in his second that he pulled back, right?
I don't know. In the first administration, his first administration was before the big attack, but,
okay.
But it was after the war was already going on at a lower level in Donbass since 2014. And 2014 is when Russia took Crimea and when they started their Sudetenland-like push in Donbass.
But we have withdrawn support, and it has made the war harder for them to fight.
We give less support. It does make it harder for them to fight. They did lose territory after we slowed up aid. You might recall that just prior to, the summer before the last presidential election, they had actually taken parts of Kursk region of Russia, right? And they don't have that anymore.
Right.
And so that's relevant. But
Which begs the big question, why President Trump has never seemed to have done anything to hurt Vladimir Putin.
I didn't want to
That's the big elephant in the room to me.
Well, that might be an important consideration. I didn't want to talk sort of about the kinds of things you're raising because I just wanted to consider what are the prospects for peace and not so much how did we get here. Obviously, if countries would change their levels of support for Ukraine, then that could change the equation in a big way. But we don't expect that soon from the U.S. Europe is helping Ukraine more and more every month.
Taking up the slack a little bit.
A little bit, but they are still prioritizing the defense of their own country, building the defenses of their own country, because they no longer think that NATO is going to continue to be a reliable sort of protection for them. So, I'm happy to talk more about it. I think I've passed my.
Oh, no. Are there any other questions? I really enjoyed the conversation. I think we all recognize that in the time of despair, and we witness the brutality and feel the hopelessness. But we also witness the tremendous courage and the sacrifice in Ukraine. So let's continue this conversation, and let's give a round of applause to I think the light shines brighter in the darkness. So let's continue the conversation and never give up hope. And speaking of light and hope, let's talk about our newly renovated Thibault Library. And this weekend is the Valentine's Day, and we have a special event in the library. So Anna Townsend will give us an announcement.
Just a reminder, we did start an event today for Valentine's Day. There are paper flowers hidden around the library, and if you find them and bring them up to the desk, you win a prize. We hid 15 today. I think there's only one left, and it must be hidden very well. And we're hiding 15 more tomorrow. So if you would like to try for a chance at that, you can come and look for those. You do get to keep the paper flower as well. And then we have our science book club that is meeting tonight. That is a collaboration between us, the Hayes Public Library, and the Sternberg Museum. We're discussing the book An Immense World, and that is at the Sternberg Museum, 6:30 to 8 tonight. You get to talk about the book a little bit, and then you get an exclusive behind-the-scenes kind of sneak peek at a Sternberg collection. So please join us for that as you are able. And thank you for continuing this partnership. We're excited to be working with a bunch of great organizations here on campus and out in the community.
Thank you. All right. I also want to thank you for saying that our audience is online. So we prepared a Zoom option so we can broaden our audiences for them to participate. And for people who cannot join us live, we also have a recording. Again, thank you a big thank you for the Thibault Library. And go online, go to Thibault Library's Times Talk archive, and you'll be able to watch all the recording from the past. Thank you so much, and happy Valentine's Day. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.